And we're live from Rocky Mountain School of Photography in beautiful Missoula, Montana. My name is Rob Gappert, and tonight we are going to be talking about hyperfocal focusing. Before we get started, I just want to give a big shout out to our sponsors, B&H Photo and Canon, for making these live streams possible. You guys are awesome. Thank you very much. All right, so let's get started. We should start talking about what hyperfocal focusing is first. It's not as scary as it sounds, I promise. But for us landscape photographers, it can be very important for us to make sure that we have the entire image in focus front to back. You know, we want all the grass, the rocks, everything in the foreground, all the way back to those beautiful mountain tops. We want everything in focus and as sharp as it possibly can be. Well, hyperfocal focusing is a way for us to get all that depth of field with acceptable sharpness all the way through the frame. Okay, so for a lot of us, when it comes to photographing a scene like this, we've been taught that we can simply, put our aperture at, small aperture at f/22, f/16, focus a third of the way into the frame, and we're going to get everything in the shot, everything we want. Yes, that's absolutely going to work, and you might even get decent results. But we can do better, and here's why. So if we take a look at our exposure triangle, we know that we can control our ISO, the aperture, and the shutter speed, right? Those are all the things we can control as far as creating the exposure that we want. So the ISO, we know that typically we want that as low as it possibly can be, right? We want to make sure that there's no digital noise. We want a nice, clean, crisp image. Well, if we're using our f/22 example, we are using a very small opening to our lens, right? So we're not allowing a whole lot of light into the lens itself or onto the sensor. So we're combining that with a very low ISO, so low sensitivity to light, and by combining those, we're actually going to have to use a very slow shutter speed. So if we're using a slower shutter speed, because typically us landscapers, we're shooting in lower light, beautiful time of day, we're very susceptible to motion blur if we're slowing the shutter speed down. So if we look at a photograph like this example here, we can see that we have all this beautiful, grass in the front, the mountains in the back. But if there was any kind of a breeze or anything like that, that grass would be moving. It would appear unsharp. It would appear out of focus. Probably not the result that we want. So every lens has a sharpest aperture. And guess what? f/22 is probably not it. Of course we want to use the sharpest one. But how do we know which one it is? So these people, I love this website. I call it the magic website, www.imagingresource.com, and the link is right below, so you can check it out. But these people have done all the hard work for us. They've tested a ton of different lenses. They show us which ones are sharp and which ones aren't. They also show us which apertures are sharp and which ones aren't. So let's take a look. All right, so this is the graphic that I look at. The Fuji 10 to 24 millimeter, that's my go-to landscape lens. On the right side, there is a sharpness scale. So we can actually see a graphic that shows us how sharp our lens is at particular or specific focal lengths and apertures. So if we look at the graph itself, the higher that line is, the less sharp it is. The lower the graphic is, the more sharp it is, right? So just to take a look, we can see, by focal length, there's actually a difference in sharpness based on the focal length of our lens. So if I go through, you can see the difference. But focal length is really not what we need to be looking at or what we're concerning ourselves with the hyperfocal method. We really want to see which aperture is the sharpest. So if I start toggling through my apertures, I can see that as I'm using smaller apertures, the lens itself is actually losing sharpness, right? So, and there's some pretty big variations. For this lens, f5.6 seems to be the sharpest aperture, so of course I want to try to use that whenever I possibly can. Okay, and look how different it is from f/22. There's a huge difference in sharpness between those apertures. It's not that it's a bad lens, that's just the way it is, right? So, and actually with this lens, f/22 is the least sharp of the apertures, so that probably shouldn't be our go-to if we're trying to take a once-in-a-lifetime beautiful landscape photograph, right? So let's take a look at another image that'll kind of tie this up a bit. So this picture here, there's absolutely no risk of motion blur, right? There's nothing in this frame that's going to be moving. So we could absolutely use f/22 without any issue. But now that we know that there are sharper apertures, why wouldn't we do that? Why wouldn't we explore that possibility? Okay. But, you know, we're used to that. You know, f/16, f/22 gives us the max depth of field. So it really doesn't even seem possible that we'd be able to get everything in focus with shooting at, you know, an aperture of f/5.6. But let's take a look and see if we can do it. All right. So hyperfocal focusing. So our goal with this is to find the widest aperture that will give us enough depth of field to ensure that the entire frame is in focus with acceptable sharpness from front to back, okay? So in order to do this, we need to know a couple things. We need to know the focal length of our lens, and we also need to know the distance to the closest subject that we want in focus, right? We know, once we know these things, we can actually use what's called the hyperfocal distance chart to tell us which aperture we should use or which one we can get away with and still get everything in focus. All right, so hyperfocal distance. I'm going to throw out the definition here. Don't freak out or don't bail on us. It sounds confusing. You'll see how it works here with a couple examples here in a minute. But by focusing your lens to this distance, you will maximize the sharpness from half that distance to infinity, okay? So if we take a look at this beautiful scene in front of us here, right? We want to make sure that the grass out front is in focus as well as those mountain peaks way in the background, right? We want everything to be in focus. That grass we know is 4 feet away. We just, you know, we look at it, we measure it, whatever. We know that that grass is 4 feet away. Those mountains, they're way back there. We have no idea how far. We just know, you know, we want them in focus. We're calling that infinity. We don't need to know exactly how far that is, okay? And we are shooting this scene with a 16 millimeter lens. So we have all the information we need right there to go forward with making this process work. So hyperfocal distance, the way to calculate that is it's 2 times the closest subject distance, okay? This will tell us where we should be focusing our lens, and then half that distance, half the hyperfocal distance to infinity will be in focus and with acceptable sharpness, okay? So if we go back to our beautiful scene here, we're using a lens, we're shooting at 16 millimeters. Our closest subject is 4 feet away. So we know that our hyperfocal distance is 2 times our closest subject. So our hyperfocal distance is 8 feet, okay? So the next thing we need to do is we need to find the widest aperture possible where we can still, based on those 2 things, based on the hyperfocal distance and the focal length, we need to find, by using the hyperfocal distance chart, we need to find which aperture we can use or which one we can get away with, okay? So this is what a hyperfocal distance chart looks like, okay? But before we jump into that, I just want to make sure everybody's aware that these charts are specific to the camera sensor sizes, okay? So the crop factor matters. If you're shooting a full frame camera, you're going to be using a different chart than I do when I'm using for my Fuji X-T3, I'm using one that shows the 1.5x crop factor. So make sure you're using the right one. So the chart itself, it's pretty simple to read. On the left side, we have our focal length, okay? For this example, we were shooting at 16 millimeters. And then across the top, we have our list of apertures. Now, the aperture is what we're trying to figure out. And we're going to be figuring that out by using all these hyperfocal distances inside the chart. So if we take a look, for this shot, we're going to be using my Fuji X-T3. It's got a 1.5x crop factor, so we know which chart we're supposed to be using, right? Our focal length is 16 millimeters. Our closest subject distance is 4 feet, which gives us a hyperfocal distance of 8 feet. So now if we look at our chart, and we're going to be looking, these are the hyperfocal distances, so we're going to be looking for the one that's closest to 8 feet, okay? Right off the bat, I can see that there's one for 7.5, it's under f5.6. So the way we want to read this is half that distance to infinity, that's what's going to be in focus. So half of 7.5 is 3.75. So it's 3.75 to infinity. That's what's going to be in focus. And that absolutely does include our 4 feet. So we can get our grass in focus as well as those mountain peaks way in the background. It's all great. You know, it's going to be beautiful. So, and the the best part about this is we can shoot it at f5.6. Okay? So if we look at this from an exposure standpoint, if we're looking at comparing, you know, before we were talking about shooting at f22 versus f5.6, let's say, for example's sake, that when we were shooting at f22, we had to use a shutter speed of a 1/15 of a second, right? So now that we start opening up our aperture to get it to 5.6, we're adjusting our shutter speed accordingly. We're able to use faster shutter speeds, and we get down to f5.6, we can actually use, with the equivalent exposure, we can shoot the same shot at 1/250th of a second. We just gained 4 stops of light. That's huge. Plus, we get to use our sharpest aperture. So it's really a win-win. It's really powerful stuff. And I shouldn't mention this because I'm pretty sure it's a written rule for all landscape photographers. You should always use a tripod, but we just went from shooting it from 1/15th of a second to shooting it to 1/250th of a second. So we could handhold the shot, but you shouldn't do that. Just don't do that. All right. So to actually take the shot, we are setting the aperture to f5.6. We're manually focusing the lens to 7.5 feet. When we do that, we know that half that distance, half of 7.5 feet to infinity, will be in focus and acceptably sharp. Okay? So let's take a look at a, excuse me, let's take a look at a real world type of example. Let's say we walk up to this beautiful scene. We're next to 1,000 of our closest photographer buddies. It's sunset and it's gorgeous, right? Well, we know by looking at this scene immediately that we want those rocks out front. We want them in focus and sharp, right? As well as we want to make sure that the back of that canyon wall, we want to make sure that's in focus as well. Well, we know, we measured or whatever, we crawled out to the edge of the cliff, we know that that's 5 feet sharp, right? We have no idea how far out that back of the canyon is. We don't care. We know that that's infinity. We're going to go with that. Okay? So today we're shooting with our Canon 5D Mark IV. It's a full frame sensor, so now we know exactly which chart we have to use, right? We have a focal length of 18 millimeters. That's what we're shooting this at. And our closest subject is 5 feet. If our closest subject is 5 feet, that means our hyperfocal distance is 10 feet because it's always 2 times the closest subject. So now we go to our chart. We look at the 18 millimeter line. We are looking for something that's relatively close to 10 feet. We'll look at 12.7 feet on our f2.8. Could be a possibility. Will it include our 5 feet? It really doesn't, because half of 12.7 is 6.35 feet to infinity will be in focus, which does not include our 5 feet. So we know that f2.8 will not work. But if we take another look at our chart, we can see that for f4, 8.9, half of that is 4.45 feet, which absolutely includes our 5 feet minimum distance that we want in focus. It'll work just fine. So we could take this shot at f4. Okay? So I'm not saying that you should take it at f4. You could. f4 might not be the sharpest aperture for your lens. So, you know, if you were shooting this, you could set it to f4, or you could use a sharper aperture. You have 5.6, 8. If those are sharper apertures for your lens, go ahead and use them, because they have more depth of field than even the f4 does. You're going to be perfectly fine. They're going to be nice and sharp. And then you just manually focus your lens to 8.9 feet and take the shot. Okay? Hopefully that makes sense. So one thing I've kind of been glazing over here as I'm going through the processes is how do you actually focus at that hyperfocal distance. Honestly, this is probably the most difficult part of the entire process. because we are focusing to a distance. We're not focusing on an object in our scene. We're actually just focusing the lens to a distance. It doesn't matter where we're pointing it. We're just turning that ring. All right. So, and even more specifically, it's not even that it's a distance. It's a specific one. It's the hyperfocal distance that we're focusing to. So how do we do it? Well, the first step we need to do is we need to switch to manual focus. So we want to take the autofocus out of the equation. So in order to actually change that distance, that focus distance, there's a couple different ways you can do it, and it really depends on the setup that you have. A lot of cameras, or a lot of lenses, I should say, they have a little distance scale right on the side of the lens, so you can look at it, 9 feet or whatever it is. You turn the focus ring to 9 feet, you're good to go. Some cameras have right in the viewfinder or on the LCD, they will have a distance scale right on the display. I think I think all mirrorless cameras, I'm not sure about the DSLR ones, but mirrorless for sure, they have a distance scale right on the screen, so you can take a look at it, turn the focus ring, get it to the distance you need, you're good to go. Now, if you don't have either one of those options, then you kind of have to go old school with it, where you're walking up to a tree, you're getting 9 feet away from it, you're focusing on that, and you're good to go. The one thing I do want to mention, though, is that you're not just, when you focus to that distance, to that tree, you're focusing from the camera's sensor, not from the end of the lens. So it may not be a big deal if you're talking feet, but when we're talking closer distances, that might make a difference. Okay, so let's go through another example. This is a relatively wide shot. I want to make sure that those rocks in the foreground are in sharp, as well as the cliffs away in the background. Those rocks are only 1 foot away, where again those cliffs, they're way out there. We have no idea how far away they are, so we're just calling that infinity. Okay. Shooting with my Fuji X-T3, which has a 1.5x crop factor, so we know exactly which chart we're going to use. Our focal length is 10 millimeters. Our closest subject distance is 1 foot, like I mentioned earlier. So that gives us a hyperfocal distance of 2 feet. 2 times our closest subject. Okay, so if we look at the chart, we look at 10 millimeters. We look at 2 feet. So this one's nice and easy, but because we can see right on that line, there's an entry for 2 feet. It's under f5.6. So again, we can take this shot, a very wide shot at 10 millimeters. We can take that with an f5.6. Again, this is the sharpest aperture I have on that lens, so I'm very happy about that. So to take the shot, we set our aperture at f5.6. We focus the lens at 2 feet. Everything from half that distance to infinity will be in focus and sharp. Okay. All right. So I've been talking a lot about these different charts. The ones I made, or the ones I got for this presentation, are from a website called outsite.com. So check them out. The link is below. But you can actually create your own chart with the proper focal lengths and which apertures you normally use. So cool site, check it out. All right. So just to kind of review the workflow, the first thing we need to do is we need to find or know what our focal length of our lens is. Then we need to know what the closest distance to the subject is. Once we have those, we can use that information to find on the hyperfocal chart what aperture we can get away with. What aperture can we get everything in focus? Set the aperture on the lens, manually focus to the hyperfocal distance, not an easy thing to say, and take the shot. So I've gone through why and how to use this technique, but exactly when should you use it? This should really only be used for compositions where you have something in the foreground that's really close, you have a background that's way back there, it's a wide angle shot. That's really when you want to use this. This would not be something, if you saw an elk way out 200 yards away with the mountains behind it, you would never use the hyperfocal distance method for that. That's, you take the shot, don't mess around with trying to figure out what your hyperfocal distance is on something that's that far away. Okay? So I've also mentioned acceptable sharpness in this presentation, and I've kind of emphasized acceptable sharpness. This is sharpness at a normal viewing distance. So all you pixel peepers out there, if you see a difference in the sharpness, if you're zooming in, you're looking at each pixel, absolutely, you're going to see a difference in the sharpness between the way background and where you focused your lens. It's going to be there, but if you're viewing it at a normal viewing distance, you're not going to see it. On a print, you're not going to see it. So it will be just fine. All right, so one final thought. I don't want you to get too hung up on trying to use this process every time. This is something that, you know, I use my Fuji 10 to 24 millimeter lens all the time, and I shoot at 10 millimeters. I know that if I set my aperture to 5.6, I focus my lens at 3 feet, I can run around and take shots all over the place. From a technical standpoint, the only thing I really have to worry about is changing my shutter speed so I get the appropriate exposure. I mean, my philosophy is, you know, technical knowledge is creative freedom. If you practice this process, you get it down, you can just go ahead and shoot. You don't have to worry about setting your aperture and your focus all the time. You can just shoot. That really should be our goal. So I want to thank you guys so much for joining us tonight. Thanks again to our sponsors, B&H Photo and Canon. If you like this video, please hit the like button below and have a great night.